The sun had not yet risen over the vast indigo expanse of the Pacific Ocean, but the silence of the morning was already heavy with the weight of history. In the early hours of June 4th, 1942, the destiny of the world rested upon the shoulders of a few thousand men scattered across a handful of ships and 2 tiny specks of coral sand known as Midway. 6 months had passed since the fiery horror of Pearl Harbor, a day that had awakened a sleeping giant and plunged the United States into a war it was desperately unprepared for. In those 6 months, the imperial war machine of Japan had swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave, conquering territory at a speed that terrified the world. Singapore had fallen. Hong Kong was lost. The Philippines were on the brink of collapse. It seemed as though nothing could stop the advance of the Japanese combined fleet, the most powerful naval force the planet had ever seen. But they were about to sail into a trap, not born of superior firepower or bigger guns, but born of intellect, courage, and a desperate roll of the dice that would change the course of human history forever. This is the story of the moment the tide turned, the moment the sword broke against the shield, the Battle of Midway. To understand the magnitude of this turning point, one must first understand the shadow that loomed over the American Pacific Fleet in the spring of 1942. Japanese Navy was a force of modernity and tradition, led by brilliant strategists who believed that victory could be achieved through a single decisive battle. Their goal was to lure the battered American fleet into a trap, destroy it once and for all, and force the United States to negotiate for peace before the industrial might of the West could fully mobilize. The architect of this grand plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a complex man who had studied in America and harbored no illusions about the crushing power he was about to awaken. He knew that if Japan did not win quickly, they would inevitably lose. The centerpiece of his strategy was the capture of Midway Atoll, a strategic outpost situated literally in the middle of the Pacific, perfect for launching airstrikes against Hawaii and serving as a fortress to protect the Japanese homeland. But while the Japanese fleet steamed eastward under the cover of believing themselves to be invisible ghosts of the ocean, a small group of American cryptographers in a damp basement in Hawaii, known as Station Hypo, were engaged in a silent intellectual war of their own. Led by the brilliant and eccentric commander Joseph Rochefort, these men worked tirelessly around the clock, surrounded by coffee cups, cigarette smoke, and stacks of paper covered in meaningless numbers. They were trying to crack the Japanese naval code, known as JN-25, a cipher that was supposed to be unbreakable. In the weeks leading up to the battle, intercepts began to pile up, all pointing to a target the Japanese simply referred to as F. The high command in Washington was skeptical. Some believed AF might refer to the Aleutians, or even a location in the South Pacific. But Rochefort and his team were convinced. To prove it, they devised a cunning ruse. They instructed the garrison at Midway to send an unencrypted message reporting that their water distillation plant had broken down. Within hours, the American interceptors picked up a Japanese message stating that AF was short of water. The trap was set. The Americans knew where the enemy was going, and they knew when they would be there. As the Japanese fleet approached Midway, they were unaware that 3 American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the hastily patched-up Yorktown, were lying in wait to the northeast. The Japanese force was colossal, boasting 4 of their finest heavy carriers, the Hikage, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that stretched to the horizon. On the morning of June 4th, the mood aboard the Japanese flagship was one of supreme confidence. They expected to catch the Americans by surprise, just as they had done at Pearl Harbor. However, the first blow of the day would actually be struck by the land-based planes on Midway itself. As the sun painted the sky in hues of orange and crimson, American bombers and torpedo planes launched from the atoll, lumbering through the air to attack the massive armada steaming toward them. They achieved little success. Their torpedoes missed, and their bombs bounced harmlessly off the thick steel decks of the Japanese warships. But they achieved something far more important. They disrupted the enemy's SIS plan and forced the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, to pause. Nagumo was a man burdened by the weight of command and rigid doctrine. He had just launched his first strike wave against Midway, and now, watching the American planes fail to damage his ships, he made a fateful decision. He believed that a second strike was necessary to soften up the island before an invasion could begin. His aircraft were currently armed with armor-piercing bombs, intended for use against enemy battleships, but he needed high-explosive bombs to destroy the airfield on Midway. Below decks, on the sweltering, cramped hangars of the 4 Japanese carriers, chaos ensued. Mechanics and ordnance men worked frantically, rolling away the heavy armor-piercing bombs and bringing up the fragile, high-explosive bombs to rearm the planes. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks as planes were refueled. In their haste to deliver the second blow, the Japanese carriers became floating arsenals of extreme volatility, decks cluttered with bombs, fuel, and aircraft. It was at this precise moment of vulnerability that the turning point of the entire war began to materialize. Hundreds of miles away, the American carriers had launched their own aircraft, sending them into the unknown to find the enemy fleet. It was a disjointed and desperate attack. The American torpedo squadrons, flying slow, obsolete TBD devastators, found the Japanese fleet first. What happened next was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Without fighter protection, the American torpedo planes descended low over the water and flew straight into a wall of anti-aircraft fire, and the agile Japanese Zero fighters, the most feared dogfighter in the Pacific at the time. One by one, the American planes fell from the sky, crashing into the ocean in flames. Squadron after squadron was annihilated. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, was completely wiped out. Not a single plane survived, but these men did not die in vain. Their suicidal bravery drew the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level to deal with the low-flying torpedo bombers. The skies above the Japanese carriers were suddenly left undefended. While the Zeros were busy picking off the torpedo planes, high above the clouds, a formation of American dive bombers arrived. Led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey from the Enterprise, they had been searching for hours, running low on fuel, on the verge of turning back. But through a stroke of incredible luck, McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, steaming at high speed to rejoin the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. He followed that wake like a trail of breadcrumbs, and suddenly the clouds broke. Below him lay the prize of the Pacific. The 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were steaming in a lazy formation, their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, their defenses distracted by the torpedo attacks below. It was a mistake that would echo through eternity. What followed was 5 minutes that decided the outcome of the Pacific War. McCluskey signaled the attack. The American SBD Dauntless dive bombers peeled off and went into screaming dives, plummeting toward the deck at speeds that tore at the fabric of their wings. The anti-aircraft guns on the Japanese ships roared to life, filling the air with black puffs of smoke, but it was too late. From the lead bombers, bombs tumbled down, aiming for the heart of the enemy. On the Kaga, a single bomb hit squarely in the middle of the flight deck, igniting the fuel and ammunition stacked there. The explosion was apocalyptic, blowing aircraft into the air and tearing through the steel ship like paper. Seconds later, more bombs hit. The Soryu was struck, shuddering under the impact as fires raged out of control. But the most devastating blow fell upon the Akagi Nagamo's flagship. A single bomb, dropped by Lieutenant Richard Best, landed with surgical precision, detonating amidst the parked aircraft on the flight deck. The chain reaction was instantaneous. The fuel tanks erupted. The armed airplanes cooked off in a spectacular display of destruction. In a matter of seconds, the pride of the Japanese Navy was transformed into a blazing inferno. The scenes aboard these great ships were scenes of Dante's Inferno. Men who had been alive moments before were incinerated by the heat. Others, trapped below decks by jammed hatches, could only wait for the inevitable as the fires spread. The discipline and order that had defined the Japanese military for decades collapsed into chaos. Nagamo was forced to abandon his flagship, scrambling across a rope ladder to a waiting destroyer, his face pale with shock and disbelief. 3 of the 4 most powerful carriers in the world were sinking or burning, their hulls glowing red with internal heat, sending thick pillars of black smoke thousands of feet into the sky. It was a catastrophe beyond imagination. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted in the blink of an eye, or rather, in the drop of a bomb. Yet the battle was not over. The Japanese still had one carrier left, the Hiryu. Hidden by a squall, the Hiryu had managed to avoid the destruction that befell her sisters. Her commander, Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, was a fiery warrior who refused to accept defeat. He launched a counterattack, sending his aircraft to find the American carriers. They located the Yorktown. Despite valiant efforts by her fighters to defend her, the Yorktown was hit by torpedoes and bombs. The great ship slowed to a halt, listing heavily in the water. She would eventually sink, taking her brave crew with her, a grim reminder that victory in war always comes at a terrible price. But the retaliation was swift. The Americans, having located the Hiryu, launched another attack. Dive bombers rained down destruction on the last remaining Japanese carrier, hitting her repeatedly until she was a burning wreck, joining her sisters in the grave of the Pacific. Admiral Yamaguchi went down with his ship, choosing to share the fate of his command rather than survive the shame of defeat. With the loss of all 4 carriers, the heart had been torn out of the Japanese combined fleet. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the news aboard his flagship battleship Yamato, hundreds of miles away, made the agonizing decision to call off the invasion of Midway and retreat. The hunt was over. The trap had failed. The superior force had been humbled not by strength, but by luck, intelligence, and the sheer audacity of men who refused to quit. In the days that followed, the vast emptiness of the Pacific Ocean bore silent witness to the end of an era. The burning hulks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu slipped beneath the waves, taking thousands of souls with them to the bottom. The Americans, exhausted and battered, had won a victory that defied all logic. They had destroyed the enemy's offensive capability. A Japanese navy, which had ruled the Pacific unchallenged for 6 months, would never again be the dominant force it once was. The industrial might of the United States, now free to mobilize without the constant threat of invasion, would eventually build a fleet of ships that would dwarf even Yamamoto's Grand Armada. The road to Tokyo would be long, bloody, and filled with brutal battles like Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, but the turning point had been passed. The initiative had changed hands. The significance of Midway extends far beyond the tactical destruction of ships and aircraft. It was a psychological turning point that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. Before Midway, the citizens of the Allied nations lived in fear of the rising sun flag. After Midway, they began to believe that victory was possible. It proved that in the modern age of warfare, information and codebreaking were just as lethal as battleship guns. It demonstrated that the spirit of a volunteer force, fighting to defend their homes, could overcome the rigid, professional military machine of a fascist empire. The courage of the torpedo squadrons, who flew into certain death to create an opening, became a legend of sacrifice that defined the greatest generation. They knew the odds were against them. They knew they might not return, but they flew anyway. As we look back across the decades at the burning decks and the oil-stained waters of June 1942, we are reminded of how fragile the course of history truly is. If the American dive bombers had arrived 10 minutes later, the Japanese planes would have been airborne, and the outcome might have been the total destruction of the American fleet. If the wind had been different, or the clouds thicker, the trap might have worked. The Battle of Midway was not just a victory of steel and fire. It was a victory of the human mind and the human spirit against overwhelming odds. It stands as a testament to the idea that even in the darkest hours when the world seems on the brink of surrender,